Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you all for joining. And thank you very much, Glen, for these teachings and your kindness. I want to remind everyone that this activity and all activities of Dharma Friends of Israel are possible because of your generosity. So you have the option to support or keep supporting this activity and future activities. Enable also other people, of course, to come across these beautiful teachings. You have the PayPal link in the chat, and I wish you all a pleasant and fruitful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Shia. So I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone back here to this Mahamudra retreat. Now we're in day 3 of this 6-day retreat. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this first session today. We'll begin with a meditation. We'll continue with that Shamatha practice of observing thoughts. But in this meditation, we'll use this practice to transition into the second variation of Shamatha practice in Mahamudra, that is resting in awareness. And I'll explain a little bit about that before we do the meditation. Then following that, we'll do a short review of some of the main points from yesterday. Then we'll go back to the text and we'll look at what object to focus on in this Shamatha practice here in Mahamudra. Then we'll look at mindfulness. There's a discussion on mindfulness in the text. Then we'll look at how to observe the mind. And then we'll do a meditation, the second variation of observing the mind, that is resting in awareness. And then time for question and answer at the end of the session. And so what we're going to do in this meditation is that we'll begin with the same meditation we did yesterday, the observing thoughts, based on the part of the text there which says, whatever thoughts arise, simply recognize each one. Just observing thoughts as they arise, without following them, without trying to get rid of them. Here, remember, thoughts is not just thinking, but it's all conceptual activity. So it includes emotions, memories, mental images, and so forth. And so we'll begin with that. And as we did yesterday, we'll be using the eyes open, either naturally or partially open. And then partway through the meditation, we'll shift to focusing on the background. So remember, the object here in this practice is the space of the mind and whatever mental events arise in that space. So we'll start by observing the mental events. Then we'll shift to actually just observing the space itself, the space in which all mental events arise, abide, and dissolve back into. We'll do that for a few minutes. And then we'll shift to turning awareness in upon itself and simply knowing that we're aware. And that is the second part of the second method for observing the mind, which we see in the text here very briefly. It says, or alternatively, as soon as any thought arises, cut it off completely, not allowing it to continue. Here, cutting off thoughts doesn't mean we're trying to block them, but cutting them off means we're not paying attention to them at all. So to cut it off means don't pay attention to any thoughts. They can still be there. We're not trying to block them or get rid of them, but we're not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. And so we'll just get a little taste of that practice, because that's the practice we're going to be doing mainly in today's sessions. So let's do that practice now. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. We begin, as always, by preparing the body. That is, establishing a good posture. So back nice and straight. And at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed. And using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And if you find it helpful as part of the preparation, you can either now do the 9-round breathing exercise that we did yesterday, or simply take 3 slow, deep breaths. And then allow the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Simply allowing it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And then preparing the mind. And as the Panchen Lama mentioned in his text, we can begin with a virtuous, pure mind by going for refuge and generating bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And by my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And then allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Thoughts, emotions, images, memories. Without following thoughts, without trying to get rid of thoughts. Simply be like an impartial observer or witness, observing thoughts and other mental events as they arise and pass. and in particular, paying very close attention to any reactions to anything pleasant or unpleasant that is appearing. And now shift your attention from the foreground to the background. That is, now mainly focus on the space of the mind itself, the space within which all mental events arise, abide, and dissolve back into. So now mainly focusing on the space of the mind. And then let go of even focusing on the space of the mind and just turn awareness in upon itself and simply know that you're aware. And just rest in that experience of awareness itself. all sorts of appearances will continue to arise. Thoughts, emotions, sounds, sensations, and so on. But now pay no attention to any appearance. We're not trying to block them. Let them be there. They can be there. We're just not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. And so simply rest in that experience of knowing that you're aware. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's start with a short review. So the text we're following here, this main path of the victors, a root text for the precious Gelug Kagyu tradition of Mahamudra by Panchen Losang Chögyal Gyaltsen. The outlines here, we saw that first there was the entering into the composition where the Panchen Lama was paying homage to Mahamudra and his teacher, his guru, and making a promise to compose the text. And then in the actual explanation, we first looked through the preliminaries for the common preliminaries and uncommon preliminaries. And in the actual text, the actual practice rather, of Mahamudra, two levels, Sutra Mahamudra and Tantra Mahamudra. And we're mainly focusing on Sutra Mahamudra here in this text. And there are two main parts to that, is Shamatha Vipassana. So we are currently looking at the Shamatha practice in Sutra Mahamudra. The Vipassana practice of emptiness will be the main focus for next weekend. And then the conclusion is also including what to do outside of meditation, in post-meditation, and then dedication of virtue at the end of the text. And so we saw the importance there of these preliminary practices that really establish the foundation for Mahamudra practice, whether it be at sutra level or tantra level. And those common preliminaries of precious human life, death and impermanence, causality of our actions, and view of genuine happiness really provide us a solid basis for a solid platform for entering into the sutra level of practice. Whereas the uncommon preliminaries here of refuge, bodhicitta, vajrasattva meditation, mandala offering, and particularly guru yoga, is really helping us to provide a solid foundation for tantra level of Mahamudra practice. And then we had a brief discussion of Tantra Mahamudra, and we saw there that Tantra Mahamudra is we are accessing this clear light mind, this very subtle level of our mind, and we access it through skillful methods such as penetrating vital points of the subtle Vajra body. And so we saw there that this also manifests naturally at the time of death. So often people who are engaging in Tantra level of practice are also doing practices such as the death disillusion practice, sleep and dream yoga and so forth to prepare themselves so that they can gain access to that at the time of death. But here, the main skillful method, penetrating vital points of subtle Vajra body, is all about completion, is the completion stage practice in Tantra. The preparation for that was the generation stage. But also we saw that another skillful method that's sometimes used are these pointing out instructions, which come in what's called essence Mahamudra. And so therefore we can talk about 3 levels of Mahamudra practice: the sutra level, which is practices of shamatha and the vipassana practice of emptiness; tantra level, the generation completion stage; and then the essence level, these pointing out instructions, short, pithy instructions, pointing out the nature of the mind, and then non-meditation instructions. But here we saw in that quote from the book from Daniel P. Brown, Pointing Out the Great Way, he said that ordinary practitioners generally do not understand the pointing out instructions because their minds are too clouded by coarse level thoughts, mistaken ideas, negative emotions, and dualistic perception of the external world. Therefore, ordinary practitioners must refine their minds through standard practices before the essence view can be introduced. Meaning that if we really want to be able to take advantage of these pointing out instructions, we need to first refine our minds through standard practices, the standard practice of shamatha and vipassana, and then also some tantra practice of generation completion stage as well. That also is very helpful, but at least have some good basis in shamatha and vipassana, because without that, then pointing out instructions, as Daniel P. Brown said, we won't understand them. They won't really have any effect because we've got too much dualistic conceptions going on in our mind. And so therefore, we start with Sutra Mahamudra. That's the basis. And in Sutra Mahamudra, we saw that this is really all about ways of meditating on emptiness, the emptiness in the perfection of wisdom teachings from the Buddha. That was further expounded on by the Nagarjuna in the 2nd century in his Mula Madhyamika Karika text. And he's saying that there's no path to liberation other than this, meaning if we want to overcome all mental afflictions and suffering, we must come to realize this emptiness that is described in these perfection of wisdom teachings. And in Sutra Mahamudra, then the 2 main practices is shamatha and vipassana. And we first start with the shamatha practice, and then we go on to vipassana practice. And in shamatha practice, we saw the text talked about 2 parts, preparation and actual practice. And in vipassana, we're going to look at a general presentation about nature of mind, and then a detailed presentation on emptiness. And so in the shamatha practice, the preparation, we saw there's two things we need to do. There's first the 6 prerequisites, which is how to establish or set up a suitable basis for shamatha practice, the outer and inner prerequisites, and then the 6 preparatory practices that we looked at in some detail yesterday in terms of what to do at the beginning of each meditation session. And so remember, in these 6 prerequisites, the first one, the supportive environment, was the outer conditions, to really get those conducive outer conditions, particularly this point of good friends, supportive friends, spiritual sangha to help support us in the practice. And then the other 5 of having few desires, being content, few activities, ethical discipline, letting go of compulsive thinking, are the inner conditions that we need to establish, these inner conditions to have a suitable basis for engaging in shamatha practice. And we saw there that to establish these inner prerequisites, the importance again of the common preliminary practices, that if we don't reflect on precious human life, death and impermanence, the causality of our actions, and also this view of genuine happiness, then you're going to find it extremely difficult to establish these inner prerequisites. And we're going to probably be very lazy when it comes to doing shamatha. We'll get distracted. We won't have time to meditate. We're too busy. Maybe our ethical discipline is not so good. And we'll have a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking about all those things out there that we need to try and get hold of to make us happy and try to avoid the things that seem to be giving us suffering. So again, the importance of preliminary practices for these prerequisites, to be able to implement these prerequisites for shamatha. And then in terms of the actual practice, we saw there in the actual practice of shamatha, we are cultivating a concentration with two aspects, stability and clarity. Not only to be able to have a stable mind to focus on the object without becoming distracted, but also to be able to focus on the object in a very clear way, overcoming dullness. But here we added this third quality that we often don't see in the meditation texts, something that we really need to pay attention to in the modern world, and that is the quality of relaxation. Because again, many of us, due to our lifestyles and chaotic minds and our habit of always tensing when we focus, we bring this into meditation practice. And then we have this striving attitude that we need to really try as hard as we can to achieve, to have success in shamatha. So we bring a lot of tension into the practice and we push very hard to make progress. And then we all have all sorts of problems in this practice, all sorts of problems in any meditation practice. So therefore, the very first thing we need to do is we need to learn how to relax the body, relax the mind. And on the basis of sinking those deep roots of relaxation, that will be able to help support this trunk of stability. The stronger the trunk of stability, the higher the branches and leaves of clarity can grow. So really initially emphasizing relaxation in any meditation practice. And then we saw that this single-pointed concentration of shamatha, remember the word shamatha is a Sanskrit term. Shama means calm, a mind that is calm, and ta means to remain or abide, meaning abiding or focus single-pointedly on an object. So shamatha is the practice of cultivating this calm, clear, focused mind. And we achieve shamatha here, we see, by applying 8 antidotes to abandon 5 faults. These 5 faults of laziness, forgetfulness, laxity, excitation, non-application, over-application. And if we apply these antidotes to those faults, then we can move along the 9 stages to shamatha. And so we saw in this colored diagram here, these 9 stages along this windy road, from directed attention up to attentional balance. We looked at the first 4 stages yesterday, and we'll look at stages 5 through 9 today. And also we'll look at the goal of shamatha. How do you actually achieve shamatha, which is the diagram in the middle at the top of this colored chart. And then we move through these 9 stages also through these 6 powers and these 4 types of mental engagement. And we'll come back to this, this chart in the next session. So now, what type of object should we focus on in this practice? So the text goes on now and says, through focusing on what type of object of meditation does one cultivate concentration? And then the Panchen Lama goes on to say, although the Bhagavan, and Bhagavan here is another name for Buddha, although the Bhagavan taught that in general, there are countless objects that are a suitable basis for accomplishing faultless concentration. Since most of the previous gurus of these instructions means Mahamudra instructions, except focusing on the mind, here also this very method will be used. And so what we find is that when we look at a classic shamatha text and it talks about what object to focus on, as the Panchen Lama has said here, we often get a very long list of suitable objects. The one object, though, that is probably most widely emphasized in many Buddhist traditions is the breath, the sensations of the breath. And particularly the sensations of the breath is has a lot of advantages for us in the modern world. In fact, there's a quote from a Sangha from the 4th century who says something like, if discursive thinking dominates your behavior, then you really need to focus on mindfulness of breathing. And so this accounts for, I think, for most of us in the modern world, we're caught up in a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking. And so by focusing on the breath, that helps us to get us out of our obsessive compulsive thinking mind into the body and get out of the past and the future into the present moment. And compared to other objects, particularly what we saw yesterday, focusing on the mind, observing thoughts, probably a number of you who've not done this practice much before probably found that very challenging, because the mind is something quite subtle to focus on, and we don't really have a habit of observing our thoughts. Whereas the breath, the physical sensations of breath, is a physical tactile object. It's a little bit easier to focus on. And so therefore, the breath is a very good place to start for many of us in shamatha practice. And also here in Mahamudra, where we're focusing on the mind, or we do this resting in awareness practice that we've just begun. Again, both of these shamatha practices are very subtle, not so easy, and it's easy to get swept away in these practices. So if we've previously gained some experience in the shamatha practice of mindfulness of breathing, then not only will our mind be a little bit more stable, clear, and focused when we begin this practice, but also then we can use the breath as an anchor to help us to get into these practices. And we did that a little bit yesterday, and we'll continue to do that today. And then here, when the Panchalama says focusing on the mind, as we briefly saw in the meditation, and it's coming up again in the text shortly, there are two sort of methods or variations to observing the mind, focusing on the mind. The first one is what we did yesterday. That is, whatever thoughts arise, simply recognize each one, meaning observing our thoughts. And the practice that we're going to be mainly doing today, we just touched on briefly in that meditation we did, is the second variation is, as soon as any thought arises, cut it off, meaning not paying attention to any thoughts, but simply turning awareness in upon itself and knowing that we're aware, resting in awareness. So these are the two variations of using the mind as the object for shamatha practice. And we'll look at, again, these two in a little bit more detail when we come to actually that point in the text very shortly. And so then we'll go back to the text now. We'll continue where we left off yesterday. And so we've now finished the preparation. We've prepared body, speech, and mind well. And then there was, again, this short discussion about the qualities and the objects to use and so forth. But then the actual instructions start here, which says, within that state of fleeting appearances, and what that means is that we've just finished the preparation. We've prepared the body, we've prepared the speech, the 9-round breathing exercise, prepared the mind. We've gone for refuge, bodhicitta. We've done this guru yoga practice, made requests to the guru, dissolve the guru into ourselves. Now our mind should be very positive, uplifted, and focused. And therefore, we're not caught up in lots of distractions. That's what it means with fleeting appearances. Our mind is not jumping all over the place. So when we're in this uplifted, focused, clear state to begin the meditation due to doing the preparation well, then the Panchalama says, do not modify anything with discursive thoughts, such as hopes, thinking about accomplishing certain goals, or fears, concerned about whether or not certain undesirable things will eventuate. And that's very good advice, because often what happens at the beginning of a meditation, we often have a lot of hope and fear. We're hoping that certain pleasant things or good things will happen in our meditation, and we're worrying about getting distracted or having a lot of negative things happening maybe in our meditation. In particular, we often come into meditation, if we've done this practice before and had certain experiences, then we often come into the practice with a lot of expectations, expecting that we'll have certain types of experiences, or expecting that we may have unpleasant experiences and so forth. So we need to let go of all of that, drop all of that, because then we're just going to be sidetracked in the practice. And then the Panchalama goes on to say, without wavering, that is, without dwelling in the past, without anticipating the future, and without moving around in the present, settle in meditative equipoise within that state for a short while. Here the word meditative equipoise means balance. So means settle or rest in this balanced state where our mind is calm, clear, and focused. Just rest in that state for a short while. Here, short while is really emphasizing the importance as a beginner of having many short sessions, to really emphasize quality over quantity when it comes to meditation. Because if we try to meditate too long as a beginner, we're not going to be able to sustain that. And for the latter part of the meditation, we're just going to get caught up in complete daydreaming and distraction and drift off into complete dullness and drowsiness. And so therefore, short sessions, always emphasizing quality over quantity. And then if we continue on, the Panchen Lama says, when settling the mind in this way, it is not that you stop your attention like when fainting or falling asleep. So we don't just sit there in this sort of dull, spaced out state. Rather, station the guard of non-forgetful mindfulness so that the mind that is unwaveringly still does not become distracted. In that way, the observed object is bound by the rope of mindfulness. And so here yesterday, in terms of those faults, we already came across the antidote of mindfulness. And so remember, this word mindfulness is a translation of the Sanskrit term smrti or the Pali term sati, which literally means to remember. And so here we saw a Sangha saying, what is mindfulness? It's the non-forgetfulness of the mind with respect to a familiar object having the function of non-distraction. And here the Panchen Lama uses this analogy of the rope of mindfulness, that we are tying our mind with a rope of mindfulness to the object. And we saw here that we need to be careful when we see this word mindfulness here, because in a lot of modern day mindfulness traditions, they've redefined the word mindfulness to mean something slightly different, such as very common in modern traditions to define mindfulness as a non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in the present moment. Again, this is a very good thing to do, but this is not really how the word mindfulness was originally defined. So mindfulness is really our ability to hold the object, to not forget it, to not become distracted. Then the text goes on and says, if, however, mindfulness degenerates, there will be a great danger of the proliferation of thoughts that will move the mind. Therefore, it is necessary to set up introspection like a watcher, in other words, quality control, to be aware of whether or not the mind is moving elsewhere due to the strength of mindfulness having become weak. So this was, again, the antidote we saw yesterday in those 8 antidotes. Introspection is quality control. It's really, in particular here, it's not in general, it's just monitoring body and mind, but in particular in Shamatha, it's really to notice if our mind is still on the object. So it's monitoring the mindfulness. Are we still holding the object, or is mindfulness becoming weak and we're now either getting caught up in distraction or falling into dullness? And so therefore, that's introspection's job, is to notice that. It's quality control. Sometimes this word, the Sanskrit term for that is samprajanya. Sometimes that is translated as alertness or vigilance, but I think this is a bit misleading, because alertness and vigilance, these words are too broad, because we can be alert or vigilant to things outside of ourselves as well, whereas introspection is reflexive. It's always looking inward. So I think introspection is a better translation, a more accurate translation than, say, alertness or vigilance in this case. And then if we go on in the text, and here we have the analogy that we see in the color chart, the 9 stages to Shamatha chart. And this is coming from Baba Viveka's, who's a great 5th, 6th century Indian master. His Heart of the Middle Way text, he says, the elephant of the mind that is out of control, so we saw that yesterday, the elephant running wildly ahead of the meditator, is to be bound with certainty by the rope of mindfulness to the firm post of the observed object. and gradually brought under control by the hook of introspection. So we see here again the two tools of mindfulness and introspection. In the left hand of the meditator, the rope of mindfulness; in the right hand, the hook of introspection. And then the text goes on, Panchen Lama says, in brief, accomplishing faultless concentration does not go beyond the manner of sustaining mindfulness and introspection. So therefore, to achieve that faultless concentration, this is what we just need, these two tools, mindfulness and introspection. And we continually cultivate and strengthen these faculties. We can move along these 9 stages and really achieve this faultless concentration, this goal of shamatha. Then he goes on to say, furthermore, mindfulness is principle. And if this is present, then introspection, which is said to be the result of mindfulness, comes naturally. So therefore, if we are improving mindfulness, our ability to hold the object, to remember the object, to not get distracted, then our ability, our introspection, our quality control automatically improves as a byproduct of that improved mindfulness. And so then the text goes on, it says then, now attentively focus mindfulness on the mind's nature of awareness and clarity and observe it single-pointedly and nakedly. And so here we see this attentively focused mindfulness. And sometimes in the text, it says, tightly focus your mind on the mindfulness. So remember here, relaxation is the basis. And we are to observe the mind nakedly, meaning with bare attention, observe it directly. And here it says to focus mindfulness on the mind's nature of awareness and clarity. Awareness and clarity, or sometimes translated as clear and knowing, is the conventional nature of the mind. And so it's really just saying focus on the mind itself. And here, the word clarity or clear is describing the entity of the mind. And this word clear or clarity implies 2 things, that the mind is not physical, so it's not the brain or an emergent property of the brain. But also the word clear or clarity implies that because the mind is clear, has clarity, therefore this allows things to appear in it, like thoughts, emotions, images. Just like because a mirror is clear, reflections can appear in the mirror. But what does the mind do? That's the second word. The mind, what is the function of the mind? It knows, it is aware, it engages in those appearances. And so if we simply observe the mind, then this conventional nature of mind, the clarity and the knowing quality of the mind become more and more evident to us as we simply focus on the mind. Whereas the ultimate nature of the mind is emptiness. And that's what we're coming to realize later in Vipassana practice by investigating the mind. So here we're not investigating the mind, we're just simply observing the mind, placing mindfulness on that mind as the object and observe it single-pointedly and nakedly, directly. And then the text goes on to say, when observing in this way, whatever thoughts arise, simply recognize each one. Such a technique relies upon introspection. So here, this is the method we did yesterday, that when we observe the mind, then whatever thoughts arise, and again, here the word thoughts includes emotions, memories, mental images, because the word thought here is coming from the Sanskrit term vikalpa and the Tibetan term namtok. And both of those literally mean conceptual activity, so all mental activity. So generally in these texts, when we see the word thought, it doesn't just mean thinking, it means all conceptual activity. So we simply observe the mind and observe whatever mental events arise in the mind and just recognize them, just see them clearly. Then that's the first approach. We did that yesterday. But then Panchen Lama says, or alternatively, just like the swordsman's battle with the archer taught in the Vinaya scriptures, having generated strong mindfulness and introspection, as soon as any thought arises, cut it off completely, not allowing it to continue. So the analogy here in the Vinaya, the ethics text, the Vinaya scriptures, is the story is that there is a swordsman who's very skilled with his sword, and then there's an archer trying to shoot this swordsman with his arrows, and every time the archer shot the arrow, the swordsman would just flick the arrow away, or cut it so it didn't pierce him. But then I think in the story, maybe he lost mindfulness at some point and then he got struck by an arrow. So therefore, we don't want to be struck by our thoughts and emotions. So therefore, in this, we're cutting them off completely, meaning that we're not paying attention to thoughts here, that we're not trying to block them, that let them be there. We're just not interested in them. We're only interested in knowing that we're aware. So we're turning awareness in upon itself and simply knowing that we're aware. So these are the two variations of observing the mind. Observing the mind and all the contents arising in the mind, or turning awareness in upon itself and just observing the mind and not paying attention to any of those thoughts arising in the mind. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do this second approach of turning awareness in upon itself and just knowing that we're aware. So just to briefly describe this practice here, and then we'll go to the meditation. So this is sometimes called shamatha with no object. In mindfulness of breathing, the object is the sensations of the breath. The practice we did yesterday, observing thoughts, the object is the space of the mind and all the mental events that arise in that space. Here, we're not focusing on any object because we're turning awareness in upon itself and simply knowing that we're aware. And again, not paying attention to any appearances. We're not trying to block thoughts or so forth, or sounds or sensations. Let them be there. We're just not interested in them. We're only interested in knowing that we're aware. And again, like yesterday's practice, if you find yourself getting caught up in any agitation, tension, distraction, it can be helpful to lower the gaze. And in particular, if you get caught up in any appearances, thoughts or emotions or something, then just simply release awareness into space, release all appearances, and just really relax completely. If, however, you find yourself simply falling into dullness, drowsiness, laxity, then elevate your gaze, maybe even look straight ahead, and then sharpen your focus, knowing that you're aware. That's the practice. Let's do that practice now. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen. happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest, in the stillness of the present moment. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And simply releasing all appearances, allowing the mind to come to rest. Not doing anything at all. Simply knowing that you're aware. All sorts of appearances will continue to arise. Thoughts, emotions, sounds, sensations, and so on. But now pay no attention to any appearance. We're not trying to block them. Let them be there. We're just not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. And so just resting in awareness itself. And if you find that you get caught up in any agitation, tension, or distraction, lower your gaze, release awareness into space, releasing all appearances and relaxing completely. Or if you find then that you're simply falling into dullness, drowsiness, or laxity, then elevate your gaze and sharpen your focus, knowing that you're aware. And simply resting in awareness itself. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Got time now for some question answers. So if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat. I'll try and answer them as best as I can.
Don't have questions yet.
Mm-hmm. While we're waiting for questions, just maybe a couple of comments on the objects that we use in Shamatha. And here we saw in this Mahamudra text, because in terms of Vipassana practice of emptiness, we are focusing on the mind itself, coming to realize the emptiness of the mind. Therefore, as a prelude to that in Shamatha, then it's very helpful to also focus on the mind in Shamatha, because that's what we're going to investigate in Vipassana practice. And so therefore in Shamatha practice, if we become very familiar with the mind by simply observing it, then it's going to be easier to investigate it in Vipassana. Whereas if we've simply done mindfulness of breathing as the Shamatha practice, and then from there we go straight into the nature of mind practice, you may find it a little bit more challenging because we're not used to observing the mind. We haven't had really any experience with that. So therefore, this is why the mind is used here in Mahamudra, but also Dzogchen systems of practice, because these are both nature of the mind practices. But as I mentioned, many people will find these shamatha practice of observing thoughts and resting in awareness quite challenging. And so therefore, as a prelude to this, it might be helpful to actually use the breath as the object for some time, to gain a little bit of experience in shamatha with the breath in terms of a little bit of stability and clarity. And then we can move into using the mind. It might be a bit easier. And then we can also, as I mentioned before, we could then use the breath as a little bit of an anchor point for these practices, that we can simply focus on the mindfulness of breathing, and then start by a little bit in the corner of the mind, noticing our thoughts and emotions, but mainly focusing on the breath. And then over time, slowly paying more attention to thoughts, less to the breath, and then eventually just observing thoughts. So we can use the breath as an anchor to help us to get into that practice, but also into the resting and awareness practice. We're going to, in the next session, we'll continue this resting and awareness practice, and we'll introduce the breath again as an anchor point for that in the next meditation.
Okay, so we have a few questions.
Mm-hmm.
Tom asks, would you recommend doing the resting in awareness practice as a daily shamatha practice?
Personally, I find the resting in awareness practice very helpful, and I use that a lot as a shamatha practice. The general recommendation for shamatha is use the object that works best for you. And as I mentioned, for many people, at least initially, the breath seems to be quite optimal because it's easier and it helps to get out of a lot of discursive thinking. But having said that, I do find though that many people as beginners find that practice we did yesterday, observing thoughts, very challenging, because we have such a strong habit of following our thoughts and emotions, or if they're unpleasant, trying to suppress them. And so to just observe them is not so easy. Whereas what I find is that this resting in awareness practice that we're doing today, once people understand what the practice is, and that can be a little bit challenging actually just to know what it is, because resting in awareness is more about being than doing. And we, in our modern world, we don't really know how to be. We always want to do. And so when this practice is explained, often people ask, yeah, but what am I supposed to do? Tell me what I have to do in this practice. Doing is the problem. Stop doing and just be, just rest, know that you're aware. But once people appreciate that that's the practice, is just knowing that we're aware, that's it, then what I find is that many people gravitate towards this practice and really find this practice very helpful. I think for two reasons. One is that by resting in awareness, then it helps also to get out of this obsessive, compulsive, discursive mind. It gives some space, because when we rest in awareness, what we notice is that awareness is open, spacious, and still. And so we can be in that state, and all this blah, blah, blah can still be going on, but it's not really affecting us. So we get some sort of reprieve from all this blah, blah, blah. We're not trying to block it or get rid of it. It's there, but it's not, we're not getting caught up in it because our mind is open, spacious, and still. So that's one reason I think many people like this practice, because it gives them be able to let go of all of that blah, blah, blah. But the second reason, and this is a little bit deeper reason, is that simply by resting in awareness, we can really intuitively come to an insight into the nature of our own mind, which is Vipassana. And so because this is very much a bridge into Vipassana, and we can really, just by resting in awareness, we could intuitively come to an insight into emptiness. And then often people, when they're just resting in awareness, often people have the experiences that they're really coming to see who they really are, because we're really touching on our inner nature. And so often people have this experience of feel like coming home to who they really are. And so that also people find very attractive. And that's very helpful, because it helps really to come into as a bridge into Vipassana practice. So yes, I mean, if we are very much are drawn to this resting in awareness practice, then we can simply use this as our standard shamatha practice, and we can do it on a daily basis. Because also one other great benefit with this resting in awareness practice is, again, as I mentioned, what we notice is that awareness is open, spacious, and still. And by resting in awareness in meditation and becoming familiar with that, we can bring that into daily life. We can have as our default mode in daily life, instead of having now our default mode in daily life is blah, 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 blah all day long. That seems to be our default mode. It's very tiring and exhausting, and it agitates us. But rather we can have this resting in open, spacious stillness as our default mode in daily life. And that's a much, much more effective platform to engage in activities in life. To be able to then, instead of react as we do now with attachment and aversion, from that open, spacious stillness, it'll be much easier to, instead of reacting, to simply respond as we need with loving kindness and compassion. So yes, this resting in awareness, I highly recommend this practice.
Thank you. Dana asks, how do you suggest creating a strong basis of preliminaries?
I'm not sure what you mean in terms of the common preliminaries, how to establish. Oh, okay. I think I know what the question is asking. What is helpful, and we saw that in an earlier quote from Tsongkhapa, is that it would be helpful to engage in each one of those preliminary practices in a sort of a more intensive way. So like, for example, the first one, precious human life, is not just sort of once or twice reflect on it and go, yeah, I got a precious human life. Okay, good, tick, next, because then it's still intellectual. And that's not going to really have much impact on us, but rather to really again and again and again reflect on precious human life. So maybe just use that as one of our standard meditation, daily meditation practices, maybe for some weeks, until it starts to really become experiential. But don't do it too long, because what will probably happen is if you do it more than a couple of weeks every day, you're probably going to get tired of it, and it'll just become sort of a mechanical thing that you'll go through, and it's not. So keep it fresh. So do it enough that you start to get some taste of it, but not too long, whereby you get bored with it or it just becomes mechanical. But that's what would be very helpful for each one of these. Do enough, long enough each day, I mean daily, for enough days to really start to get a taste of it. And then once we have some experiential taste of these preliminaries, then what we can do, as Tsongkhapa said, is then, like in the prayers for meditation, we can simply do that 4-line verse at the beginning of meditation. We can simply, the first line, the precious human life is, it says here, is the precious life of leisure and opportunities rare and easily lost. So if we simply recite that, we can having done that meditation and quite a number of times previously and had some experience, when we then recite that or mentally recite it, then we can quite quickly come to that same experience. Whereas if we haven't previously really reflected on that precious human life in a more extensive way over a longer period of time, when we recite this, it'll really just be mechanical, and you'll go, I understand. I got a precious human life. I know that. Okay. And it's still intellectual. So that's what I would recommend, is first make it experiential, and then we can keep reminding ourselves regularly using these sort of verses here to keep so otherwise, if we don't, that experience of precious human life, after some time, it'll fade away and we'll lose it. Whereas if we've got it, and then we keep sort of adding to it a little bit by doing these short reflections regularly, then that's going to be helpful. So that's what I recommend for these preliminaries. Maybe one more question and then we'll take a break.
Sorry, I was on mute.
So I think what happened? Everyone's gone.
So a question from Noah. He asks, when you observe the space of the mind, the background, can it be visual?
When we begin any practice, we can use aids to help us to get into the practice. So we could use these metaphors, like the mind is like the sky and the thoughts are like clouds moving through the sky. So we could use these sorts of things to help us to get into the practice, to know what to do and to help us to get in. But then if we continue to use these aids, these sort of visualizations and so forth, then that they'll become a little bit of an obstacle as we go into the practice. So if you find it helpful to begin the practice, to get into the practice, then that's okay to use these things a little bit, but then slowly we'll need to let go of them. A little bit like in mindfulness of breathing, often to help us to get into the practice, we introduce counting the breath to help stabilize our attention. And that can be useful initially, but if we keep counting our breath, then that eventually will block how far we can go into the practice, because we're adding something extra that's not actually in the practice. So likewise here, we're adding something extra, a little bit of visualization or even a little bit of commentary to remind ourselves what to do, but then use it sparingly, and then slowly we'll need to let go of that and stick to the actual core practice to go deeper. So the answer is in the short term, yes, we can, but in the long term, we'll need to go beyond that. Okay, we've run over time a little bit there, so let's stop there. I think there's probably one or two more questions, but we'll look at those in the next session. And so in the next session, we'll continue in the practice, in the text rather, and it talks a lot about how to settle the mind, how to go a little bit deeper into the practice once we've started to observe the mind. And then also we'll finish off that 9 stages to shamatha, those stages 5 through 9. We'll look at that in the next session as well. But let's take a break now and come back at 10:15.